Yeah, so I think I may have a good opening question, and it comes directly from one of the questions that you just asked. But I think a good place to start, and I think that you both set up a very interesting constraint, like almost like a conceptual poetry constraint for us, by first assigning us the role of listening poet. Is how that was the vernacular version of what it was. Maybe we put listener in residence is another term, but to be assigned the role of listening poet was very interesting. I think it made us feel to some extent, I'm speaking for myself now, but the question is going to be for everyone, right? But it made me feel kind of special, participating in the symposium. But also it got me thinking about obviously my positionality and what the heck does it mean to be a listening poet at a conference, because that's not something that usually happens. So I think the initial just constraint of assigning us this role really set up a very interesting, in a sense, structure for the processes that would follow, but especially for having us think about our positionality and try to imagine, even make up what it would mean to be a listening poet at a symposium. So my first question for everyone is sort of, how did it make you feel to be told you were a listening poet or a listener in residence? And what do you think the consequences of that assignment were? Klara, Tsitsi. Tsitsi, do you want to start?
Oh, sure. I'm happy to start. Sorry about it. It's the Zoom. We haven't yet learned how to listen into that collective pause that in a room, how other things let you know, we know where our eyes are looking. I loved this invitation. I mean, the conference itself looked so inspiring and special in and of itself. Like the collection of people who were talking and thinking together, that I just wanted to be part of it and was planning to attend it. And then I was like, which is simply to say that we often have this message, I think, that things that have consequence are things that can be said in an expository way, that when we're doing work, conferring, agreeing, comparing, all of, thinking, earning a living, that it's prosaic, right? And that poetry is this thing, certainly in my institutional context, poetry, you can put it on your CV if you want to, but it's really, they're not asking, have you done your work for the university? And so just to be recognized as doing things of value when fully inhabiting a poetic way of thinking, feeling, being, attending was very gratifying. And there was also something of sort of the recognition of our, I would say, lost introversions in the dignity and value and importance of listening, not of being the person who has the first thing to say or lots of things to say, was very moving. So I felt great. And then to actually have the motivation to sit and listen to every session, because that was the other thing, I felt very much on point. Like I couldn't just, skip the last session or whatever. And never does that at a conference, right? Goes to every session, maybe your first graduate student conference every year, and then it's done after that. So that also, the sense of accountability to the speakers was very special. Yeah, I'd love to hear what one of you all would like to follow with.
So I'd like to echo Tsitsi's comment just about how wonderful it was to be invited into this process. And I think it's already been, very very well articulated how generous that felt, to be in that position, and also to be in that kind of open position in which we weren't really told what was expected, but could kind of craft our own understanding of what the role of being a symposium poet might entail. I think most of us here are both poets and in some way affiliated with the university, right? So in that sense, it was a really intriguing experience for me because it allowed me to attend an academic conference as in this other part of with this other part of me, and to listen differently as a result. So I've been curious about my own difficulty in terms of listening for a long time, actually. And whenever I go to conferences, academic conferences, actually also when I go to poetry readings, I find that I often don't listen very well. And that I dream about things, and I have to really, really make a concerted effort to take notes and to focus and to think in a kind of linear way, I guess, to follow an argument. And I feel like what listening as a symposium poet allowed was for me to forget about that. And so I wasn't necessarily listening with the same kind of responsibility to that argument, and more just like out of curiosity and kind of just being like, oh, this sounds interesting, and kind of grasping onto a certain phrase or a certain idea. And then, I mean, I'm also exaggerating, right? But I feel like I was allowing myself more gaps in the listening process, which then, ended up informing the way I approached the poem that I wrote. Yeah, I'll stop there, but.
I agree. It was so liberating in so many ways to be a listening poet, and was such an amazing experience. I was thinking how people can be lecturers or readers, right? Lecturer means reader, literally, like from lector, from legere. But and you can have a job as a lecturer, as a reader, but I've never seen a job as a listener. And I found that was fascinating and validating in so many ways, as Tsitsi mentioned, and liberating the way that Klara mentioned too, because what does it really mean, active listening, right? Can it be creative listening? What would that entail? And I feel like we in that sense, it was very validating and liberating, because we could employ creativity while listening, like perhaps the equivalent of doodling that people say it helps your attention, but it opens like a rhizome, so your attention, your listening can go in different ways. And I found that was interesting because, let's say, for example, when I was listening to Dylan Robinson, which I'm very excited about it, I basically stopped writing. I couldn't do any creative writing, but it was what I expected to write about was not necessarily what I wrote about. I feel like the poems that I was able to generate came more from when I let go of any agenda, when I was not trying to write anything. And then that's when it took me to interesting places. So there is a relationship with letting go, listening and letting go, in that sense, that led to creativity. It was not necessarily like this kind of focused listening that, for me at least, generated the most interesting poems. But I was also thinking about positionality a lot, as you mentioned, Jason, and I feel like there was this idea of what does it mean to do when you are listening to a conference and writing, what does it mean to write an after poem? And I feel like Tsitsi and I both played with those prepositions, so after and with. Are we writing with? Are you writing after? And I was curious, Tsitsi, how do you decide on poems with someone instead of after someone? I went back and forth too.
Oh, that's a great question, Carlos. One thing I just realized I should say is that when I said I listened to every session, it was only because we got the recordings, right? And the whole experience of what listening means and what's possible, etc., has just changed so much in the last couple of years. And it's such a strange sensation because there's been this incredible intimacy in the midst of isolation and in the midst of kind of this dizzying differential in terms of the impact of losses from the pandemic and all that went with it. So it's like, I feel as though, I mean, as if Kofi Agawu was hanging out in my kitchen when he introduced the session at the beginning, and I'm listening on a computer, etc. Right? So there's this intimacy there, and I feel as though I'll always have a particular, Whole Foods parking lot in my head as the acoustic environment for parts of the conference, because that's what I was listening on headphones to, etc. But this question of with and after, for me, maybe because I was listening to the recordings a lot, the after, the factness of it was less clear than if I had only had one chance. And so maybe with wound up being that they were with me. And then also that I was surprised by how important it seemed to me to have the opportunity to be back in the room with some people who I'd known at earlier moments. And I'll say that, you know, I wrote poems like the one with Shauna or with Tekla. In both cases, I haven't talked to them about their paper, you know, and I feel like I want to, especially sometime before this really lives out in the world. I really feel that I need to, because in a way there was a certain liberty taken of saying this kind of closeness, and with these elements of my relation to them as people and thinkers. And it's so interesting to me that it's like, it's as if I don't know three different, you know, bodies that are like Shauna thinker, Shauna activist, Shauna listener, whatever, but you know what I mean? So, so just to say that the with was because for me, everything was more fluid and messy in a helpful way. But I often think of after as a term that's helpful to when I'm following, or to mark having learned a lesson from. And for some reason, with was coming for these ones. How was it for you? How did you decide on that, Carla?
I was thinking about George Abraham and the way they conceive of the after poem as something that creates community. So I don't think my after is very different from your with. Mm-hmm. I was just trying to honor where the little spark of the poem came from, as almost like as the title of the poem, instead of having as a footnote, as a bibliographic information, as the title of it. Like kind of inverting that. But I really don't think my after is very different from your with. I just felt, and I love prepositions. As a non-native English speaker, I always make preposition mistakes, quote unquote mistakes, but you're always aware of positionality because of that. So I just love the way we are playing with prepositions in general. And I agree with you. I feel like it was incredibly intimate to be there in the room creating. It was almost like being at a very cool cafe writing poetry, but like everything that was playing in this cafe was these amazing lectures and presentations, right? So there was an intimacy to it. It felt like I felt very comfortable writing in that space because we were both validating and liberating in some ways. But yeah, but I wonder if Jason and Klara, if you thought about that relationship as well in terms of positionality.
Yeah, I think it's such a great question. And I mean, going back even to just the idea of this position of listening poet, right? And how odd it is in some ways. Like I was thinking there aren't many formal listening positions. Like there's a court stenographer, right? You know, who is often relied upon to recall things that have been said. I was thinking of some military roles where they're assigned, you know, listening positions, like at listening posts and things like that. But I really did feel like with this background, you know, with this role assigned in our virtual environment, that like I had a civic duty of some kind to be, I was officially like, you know, part of the polis here, and my role in this you know, civilization or whatever is the listening poet. And we don't know what that means, but I took it very seriously. And I think Tsitsi's point about then the rights we have, I guess, around the materials that we're listening to in that context versus after is extremely interesting. I think I really did approach the listening with before or during and after, because I imagined what I was writing were really just raw notes for something to be made later. So I wasn't necessarily imagining myself writing anything, but I assigned myself, even within this constraint, further listening constraints. Like for a while, for particular sessions, I would say, only write down metaphors, because like we're thinking, that was one of the themes of the symposium, obviously. So what metaphors for sound are being generated just in this discussion, that's happening, or similes, or, so I would sometimes just strategically record, only certain kinds of things. Other times, like we all do, just writing down things that kind of sounded fun, inspiring, like something that I could work with later or whatever, facts, but it really was initially, I guess we're getting into listening techniques to some extent, and what this rule sort of moved us into as listening techniques. But my initial listening technique during the live sessions really was to document and have a first literally notebook. I started a new notebook for this purpose. I had a really nice one that I hadn't used, and so I gave it the honor of being the listening poet's notebook, right? And really to fill a notebook with materials that I could then begin to work with. That's how I imagined it initially. But again, just the idea of what my sort of duty was to the symposium as a listening poet was extremely interesting. And so my duty was to capture stuff that hopefully would inspire me to generate compelling creative works afterwards, right? But I do think the point you made, Tsitsi, about if I end up integrating a lot of material, literally things said by, say, Dylan Robinson or someone else, right? What then are my rights to those materials ultimately? And given that the community isn't that large, right, that more people than I do, I think, who attended the symposium, but even so, in some cases, I might want to actually check in with the person and say, is this cool? Is this poem cool? Because I was positioned in a role of actually listening to you and given the authorization to sort of take, in a sense, anything that I heard and do something with it, right? But ultimately, within this social setup, how far can we take that, so I thought that was a really interesting point that you made.
Before the conversation goes too far away from after and with, I was struck by, I feel like with resonates this kind of intimacy that you've all been talking about, you're with the people who are presenting, whereas after has both a relational and a kind of temporal dimension. It's you can write something after someone, right? You can say, I'm writing this poem after Dylan Robinson, but you can also say, I'm writing this poem after the fact of listening to that person. And so it becomes this interesting, kind of merger of being present and being, archival, and being after the poem becoming an artifact that exists in dialogue, but also as a record of, or as a kind of interesting form of documentation of that listening practice. And so just thinking about after and with, I would say that I was writing during. And this is really going back to also, I think, what Jason was saying, and I think Jason also mentioned during. But my technique my technique as a listening poet was to take notes on a Word document that I was then manipulating in real time. So what ended up happening was that I didn't actually have notes anymore afterwards. The document, I was deleting things that I wasn't using, and adding new keywords and new elements to that same document across different panels and across a couple of days. And so the poem really was written during the conference, and only moderately edited afterwards. What else did I want to say about that? In relation to the because I was writing and changing so actively, and also engaging with different materials, kind of in a kind of organic conjunction with one another, the question of writing after someone in terms of using their intellectual materials, I think I'm not sure that it would be recognizable anymore. I think the words that I used were so decontextualized from the original research that it would be hard to actually even find them back. And so in a weird way, whereas most of the words in the poem are found, as in I listened to them and transcribed them, they're also, they're no longer situated directly in the original research. So they're kind of traces, I guess.
I'm going to jump in. Very excited about it. You said, Klara, about the archival or documentary part of it. I was also thinking about the idea of documentary poetics, and thinking about the roles that Jason mentioned. Like, you can be a stenographer in a listening role, or you can be one of those code breakers from World War II listening to the messages, or you can be a listening poet. I guess these are the three choices, three options of listening jobs that are out there. We definitely felt we're lucky to have this third choice. But I'm thinking of this idea of what does it mean to do documentary poetics, right? What are we documenting? Is this close to creative nonfiction, the way we think about creative nonfiction these days, but with, of course, playing with the forms and what we do as poets as well? Not even trying to define poetry here, of course, but I'm thinking of Philip Meters and the way he thinks about or Naomi Shihabni, the way, but what do you document when you're listening? But of course, there's a particular event of listening. Even though the time is fluid, you can listen after, during, you can listen to the recordings. But this role is so interesting, and it is definitely a social function of poetry that I feel like does create or reverberate with community. I think this is really fascinating. The other thing I wanted to say is thinking about techniques. It's interesting to see the poems that try to document or use specific words that were listened to, and poems that just try to create new worlds. And I feel like, Jason, you did both of those things. Your visual poem for Dylan Robinson is just amazing, and it really recreates those layers that Dylan was talking about, and it made me think of the event that Klara, Faith, and I, it was an event we organized called Under Names, and you really did under names on the paper, literally, like you layered nouns and terms. But then your other poem really created a new world from like one quote, and then ran with it, and it's amazing. Created this like I'm thinking, what is that artificial world? And then not the Facebook one, the original one. I forgot now. We can call it dreams, but you really created a new world. So I feel like those two directions are both documentary in some way, right? But they just document different things. So I'm interested if you felt you were more as a poet, if you felt sometimes you were more trying to register, record something, or trying to open doors that those presenters gave to us.
Thanks, Carlos. Yeah, I think that I never thought of myself as being in a role of documenting something. Well, I think first of all, I knew that everything was being recorded, and so it had audiovisual documentation of the entire series of events, right? But in all seriousness, I think I felt just the opposite. That what I was writing down was not in any way for documentary purpose. This wasn't a poetry of testimony in any way, like of something that was happening now, but it was really capturing things that were captured 100% for the purpose of some kind of shaping something weird and new, right? Like, so basically working on a poem. So it was really just sort of raw, it was quite selfishly raw materials for me to generate something that I hope would then resonate with everyone who was there afterwards, but hopefully even in an unrecognizable way. It's kind of interesting that the during and after question, it's true. I took this quote from Jason Robinson that basically just said, Pauline Oliveros was an early adapter of Second Life. So that was the one quotation, you know, in the entire poem. But then I just tried to imagine, what Pauline Oliveros actually sort of caught in Second Life would be like. And I kind of tried to designate that world as a world without sound, because if we're thinking of, because the entire symposium was about metaphors for sound. So I was thinking, well, if we could imagine a world where metaphors for sound would be absolutely impossible, because the conditions of that actual virtual world were such that sound did not exist in any way that we could even imagine. And so it was kind of really more of a conceptual engagement really with the theme of the symposium, but through an imagining of a soundless world. and imagine Pauline Oliveros in a soundless world, like how awful and sad that sort of really is, right? And how, I guess, as an agent in the poem, she became someone who was, even without that ontological possibility of sound, was still in different ways engaging with the implications of it, like as though there was still a resonance of sound in that world, even though, according to my, my definition of that world, sound did not exist at all. So that was, yeah, just a total sort of extrapolation from a very small, which I found very interesting, and I didn't know about it, and then did further research into it, sort of point about Pauline Oliveros, that she was an early adopter of Second Life, and she in fact joined an orchestra in Second Life, and they did compositions in that environment, and that continues, right? Whereas the other poem that I worked on afterwards, engaging only with the audiovisual materials, and that was part of a longer practice that I've been engaging in for many years, which is something that we've been doing in spoken web, at least, for the last 5 or 6 years, where we would listen to a poetry reading and engage in sort of transcription of different kinds, or or mapping what we were hearing. So engage in drawing, paint. We would just put a bunch of materials out there for people to use, with canvases, in fact, and like small canvases, cheap ones you can get at the dollar store, and people would essentially listen for an hour, and then we would share what kind of visual outcome happened on the canvas, right, and talk about it. And so I was sort of engaged in doing that kind of listening practice that we've been doing, and that's the first step. And you're right, and Dylan Robinson's talk seemed particularly useful for that, because it was about details and remarking details. And as I was recording more and more the actual details of the earlier portions of the talk, were getting lost because they're being obscured by the next layer. And so it sort of was a kind of poem that was specifically about paying attention to details, and then the obstructions of being able to pay attention to details as I was continuing to write it. And I wanted to capture some of the layers, although I didn't capture all of them, but I took photos of some of them along the way, just so you could get a sense of that process. So I think I actually have like 13 maybe images of it as it progressed. But for both of these pieces now, so I should say that as far as process goes, it's ongoing. It's not over yet. I think, I'll be working with these materials for a very long time, because I still have a notebook full of stuff that I haven't worked with. And we have all these recordings that I still want to engage with, and I want to do more of these listening poems. But I'm also now, with the invitation to record some of them, sort of working on thinking about making sound pieces out of them. So rather than just record them, like, what would it mean to actually make a sound piece out of the Dylan Robinson poem? And essentially what I've done is I recorded myself reading each layer that I did capture visually. And now I'm going to do this sort of big multi-track sort of sound piece that will try to integrate that babble and clarity that can come through. And so I'm trying to figure out a way to do that so that it doesn't become boring. So I need to make it sort of a shorter piece than possible, but so there'll be a kind of multi-vocal version of that will try to capture what's there visually. And with the Pauline Oliveros poem, I did sort of go down the rabbit hole of listening to a bunch of the orchestral performances of the Second Life Orchestra. And so I've taken some of the sounds that they created in various performances, and I've begun manipulating them. And I think I'm just going to create a kind of background environment to the reading of that poem. So there'll be actual Second Life orchestration, as background sounds for the piece, So yeah, it's been very inspiring to think about moving across media as well, I should say. We already were thinking and listening across media to begin with, but then to continue to move these pieces and the techniques we were using for listening into other media, I think results in new techniques of listening along the way as you're actually producing the object. So yeah, it's all just been a lot of fun.
I really want to hear Tsitsi's response, because I know that you were also listening to the recorded material that Jason's gesturing to. But can I just very quickly, in a 1-minute response, just push back on Jason's thing about not documenting? Because I would argue that even by virtue of making your own world while listening, you are documenting. And this is exactly where I'm coming from when I'm saying, like, I don't always listen very well, because yeah, I wouldn't be able to like summarize every paper that I listened to. However, I was doing something in response. And so like in a kind of more twisted and like kind of like random, you know, way, that is kind of like these shapes behind me and they're like little waves resonating. You're still responding and you're still documenting, right?
Yeah, I agree. If you want to call it like, so if you want to expand the concept of documentation beyond sort of say some basic transcription that can be used for official purposes, but it was more like a phenomenological documentation of all of our own experiences and where they would go. Yeah, so in that sense, sure.
And I happen to know that another Montreal-based poet, Michael Nardone, has just been invited to go to LA by Divya Victor to document a performance. And I asked, you know, what is that? Like, are you video recording this event? Like what's happening? And Michael said that he has to do a creative response piece. So it's kind of similar to what we were doing.
I would jump in half a minute, and I'm glad you pushed back, Klara, and I agree. And I think documentary poetics is an open field, right? So it's very interesting. And I would even argue, even though that might not have been your intention, Jason, that by layering those words, you documented the process of colonial erasure that Dylan Robinson was talking about in a brilliant way. So that might not have been your intention, but this like words under other words, languages under other languages, it's like, I think your poem performs that in a way that a linear poem wouldn't be able to.
I agree. I mean, it definitely, I was thinking of Jordan Abel's work as I was doing it, you know, and this was a different way of, in a sense, trying to represent it. But yeah, it's all about the definition of documentation, I suppose. But if we want to take it into an open field direction and just anything you write down is documentation, I'm all for that. That's fine.
Jason is our advisor, Tsitsi, so we love pushing back.
I'm enjoying just being with you guys, because it's like bits and pieces of the ongoingness of your conversations come through, but also, you know, like it's I've never gotten to meet you, any of you, in person, you know, and I'm so glad that Nina thought to put us all in relation, because I didn't know about the amazing stuff that Spoken Web is doing, and I was struck, Klara, as you were saying now and just earlier as well, that we have this idea of being good listeners, and of knowing how to listen, and it struck me how many different ways of talking about practices of listening, methods, principles, values, all of those things we were kind of working with as givens, that I often find myself trying to describe in a sort of, I guess, a sort of phenomenological kind of way, in a very granular, specific to this is what I am doing when I listen kind of thing. But that makes me think that just as music is this huge spongy thing with metaphor and that dyad, that listening itself would be an interesting thing there. And the other piece that I was thinking about from the very beginning of the conversation is that as a bad listener myself, somebody who struggles to pay attention, etc., right? I think the gift of poetry is that you all the mishearings, the quirky okay, the ones timing is a little off, and then in between the language something weird pops up or plops out or what have you, but it's just that attention is a challenge. And so I kept really struggling to remember the name of this whole symposium. I had to keep Googling, okay, naming, understanding, playing, metaphors, music. And I one of the things is I realized I actually don't know exactly what I mean when I say metaphor. you know, I mean, I can teach someone the difference between a metonym, a metaphor. I have this sort of image of having carried something over, but the principle of the conference itself, which is that there were the scores of ways of trying to think about these questions, and the sort of incommensurability in some ways of the many different places from which people were coming at what were ostensibly a restricted set of ideas, right? Had a big payoff. That was part that was the whole value of it, right? Was that these could mean any number of things. But in the end, the one that I found was central for me was the playing with. And I think that poetry, because it does imply making things and a certain kind of, something's there that wasn't there before, in its sense of creativity, allows for playing to be deep play, deep listening, the way that you come to know or to think, the way that you come to have a different understanding. And so I'm not sure what, if anything, this is saying, except that having to keep going back over and over and just try and remember even this naming, understanding, playing, metaphors, music. I wish I'm exaggerating that this is an attention challenge, but it's the thing where it's like you slow down enough to really say, okay, none of these are givens. I wouldn't have expected to be thinking about a lovely Derridian revisiting of these things alongside what kind of music are we actually listening on Algerian radio, alongside, you know, Brunhilde, or, you know, like all of the just incredible range of areas of thought and activity that we got to be part of. And having a role, like a singular role, that implies that at the end of the symposium, the thing that has come together, that we will be rendering the togetherness bit of it, right? Gave a certain assurance that that whatever we made, and this also really helped that it wasn't just one of us, right? Whatever this ensemble came up with could be a rounding out of this collection of things that we all have a strong sense, and I think even more so after having witnessed such rigorous and creative thinking from all of the presentations, that something whole can come out of these huge varieties, which is, I think it would be moving no matter what. But for me, it really, it's very powerful at this time when I think I have become much more aware of how mediation fractures and shatters our world as well as holds it together, right? The very fact of having been on a computer in the midst of just calamity, like 1 million people in the United States of America, and then a few thousand more are like no more. And I more or less didn't miss a day of work. You know, it's just it's a profound thing. And so something of this idea of gathering, of being able to make wholes, even if their wholeness is in their unraveledness and the ribboniness of the visual, that the graphics that we have are, and the revisitability of it, just seemed very important. And the ceremonial role of poet in every culture, in every time, something about what poetry does is it shifts us. I think that acknowledging that that's part of coming together, and that it's a thing that one can make space for in a conference, is very moving. So yeah, Carlos.
I'm getting really excited with what you're saying, and this idea, what you and Klara was saying, basically about what does it mean to be a good or a bad listener. And I feel like by validating us as listening poets, you gave us permission to be perhaps a different kind of listening. And listening to what, right? Because we're not just listening to what's being said. We're listening, as Tsitsi mentioned, to the undercurrents as well. We're listening to our own listening process, listening to our own positionality, as Jason said. So all this is listening as well, right? It's not a strict documentary transcription, but we are definitely listening to these undercurrents, the context of the pandemic, our own positionalities and privileges of being able to even participate in this conference. And I feel like playing really plays an important role in here. This giving yourself permission to play with it, to be open while you're listening. And that was really my process. Was I love free writing, so I try to do at least one free writing per presentation, and see where it takes me. And like this idea of following this thread, and give yourself permission to follow this thread without imposing an agenda. And I feel like when I do this, all those layers of listening come through. And what interests me as a poet is what surprises me, right? It's not what I'm trying to say necessarily. It's what is not being said, is what I'm just can tap into. But I feel like we really get into the idea of what do we listen to when we are listening poets, right?
I'm going to jump in and just say, I think the with metaphors part was enormously important and loaded. So those three verbs, of the three verbs, the playing was a given. I agree, Tsitsi, with that, and that was really important. For me, the understanding verb was extremely important because, Nina and Danny, I don't know if they were thinking of it this way, but this was almost a cruel challenge, right? To create a listening poet and have them have the main thing around which or with one is thinking to be metaphors, because this is the bread and butter of the material of the poet, right? It's essentially like, naming, understanding, and playing with notes or something like that. If you're a musician, sort of like, so you're giving us this core substance that as a poet we're often working with, and you're troubling our relationship to it from the get-go, right? And so you challenge in a way a whole bunch of processes and techniques that we might normally sort of dive into, which is often engaging and using metaphors to express something, so anyways, so it became for me very much a process of understanding what metaphor is for me within the context of playing with language as a poet. And so there was for me, the process was, I don't know, it was probably a little bit more philosophical than it usually is for me when I'm working or writing on poems. And yeah, both of the pieces that I engaged in sort of really had me thinking about trying to resist in some ways the forces of metaphorical work, or expression, because, you set us up to to be in a way in a weird position to metaphor from the get-go. So thank you for that. Yeah.
But what really struck me though from a lot of the listening of the conference was that everything becomes metaphor, right? And this is something that the conference was grappling with, that sound and music in particular, it's impossible to talk about it without making some kind of poetic statement about it. And so that was one of my first kind of like mind blown moments at the conference, where it's just like, okay, so everything we do actually is just existing in metaphor via poetry.
Thanks, everyone. This has been such a wonderfully rich conversation.